coming to my webinar today. I'd like to thank Deb Perryman and the other folks for sponsoring this event. And we'll just dive right into it. First question here: how did you get started in this field? Well, purely by accident. I'm a biologist, an ecologist, evolutionary ecologist, and 20 years ago, I had a chance to go visit Chernobyl, and it started small, more of a hobby kind of thing, and since then it's sort of progressed into a full-time effort. So anyway, it's been great. It's been really a great experience for someone like me who likes to do field work and travel and learn new things. So anyway, today I'm going to talk a little bit about the effects of radiation in the environment, and most of the studies involve studies of Chernobyl and Fukushima, but they have broader application. But before we get into the details of the findings, let me just start with a little review, some Physics 101, for those of you who aren't familiar with radiation, the details. It comes in various forms. One of the most important aspects of radiation is that it sometimes comes as electromagnetic radiation. Electromagnetic radiation is, pervades the environment. And if we look at this little graph here, it shows the range of different kinds of electromagnetic radiation, starting with regular radio and television and then microwaves, and then we have the visible light, starting with infrared, the visible spectrum in the middle here. Let's see, do I have a pointer? I think I have a pointer. Anyway, I guess I'll skip that. Then it goes into the ultraviolet, and the very bottom end of the ultraviolet, over here towards the right, or the very high end of the ultraviolet, sort of impinges on what we call ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation is high energy electromagnetic radiation that can actually split apart molecules and charge them and modify our organic substances in particular. And then we have X-rays, and then followed by gamma rays. And all of these ionizing types of radiation can actually damage DNA and other parts of the body as well. The sort of radiation we're interested in today comes in other forms, in particular the particles of radiation that are produced by the decay of radioactive isotopes of a wide variety of elements. Again, the elements that we're particularly interested in are isotopes of uranium and plutonium, which are used as fuel in nuclear power plants, but also as fuel for atomic bombs. And so, the breakdown of radioactive isotopes can generate gamma rays. They can generate beta particles, which are basically electrons that can go a little bit further, and then alpha particles, which are basically the nucleus of helium atoms. They don't go very far. They're stopped very easily, but when they do hit something, they have such mass that they can do a lot of damage. And so, the impacts of radiation on biological systems include direct damage to the DNA, where the radiation hits the DNA and either breaks it apart or causes a change in the sequence of DNA, or it can be indirect effects as a result of the ionization of the water and other molecules inside our body, but particularly water, which, when it's ionized, can generate hydrogen and hydroxyl radicals, as well as oxygen-free radicals that can do a lot of damage to not only the DNA, but the lipids and the proteins and other organelles inside the cell. Can the Hulk be real? No, sorry. We don't see that kind of effect. Why study radiation effects in natural systems? Well, the first reason is that, because we can't see it, taste, or smell it, we don't even realize it's in the environment, but it's everywhere, really. And it's been well documented since the time of Marie Curie in the early 20th century that ionizing radiation can have very large negative effects on biological systems. In fact, Marie Curie died at a relatively young age as a result of handling the radioactivity in her lab during her life. There are many anthropogenic sources, human-generated sources of radiation, which have been increasing dramatically in the environment as a result of atomic bomb testing, nuclear power plants, and especially medical use of radiation. So we need to know more about it. Even though we can't see, taste, or feel it, it's there, and it's potentially of significance for us living in this modern day environment. There's also the issue of future accidents at power plants, terrorism, and even nuclear war, which has come up with issues between India and Pakistan, as well as North Korea, and even between Russia and USA more recently. So we need to know more about the effects of radiation, because it's an issue that's going to grow in its importance. So starting with first, again, sources of radiation in the environment. Turns out that we have more than 400 nuclear reactors in operation around the world, and a bunch more being built, and all of these nuclear reactors actually generate radioactive effluents. And this graph right here just simply shows the range of radioactive effluent production by nuclear power plants in the U.S. The good news is that it's decreased dramatically in the last few decades, but the bad news is that they all produce radioactivity that's released into the environment, and most of us really aren't aware of that. Are there negative impacts of cell phones on humans? So cell phone radiation, microwave radiation, high frequency radio waves cannot ionize things. But of course, if you get blasted with a high enough intensity, it can certainly heat up the water like a microwave oven and cause damage that way, but not direct effects, because it's not ionizing radiation. The energy in that electromagnetic spectrum is not high enough. Another source of radiation in the environment comes from atomic bombs. The first atomic bomb was exploded in July of 1945 in Alamogordo in the U.S., and then there were two more in August of 1945 that were dropped on Japan. And then, interestingly enough, what most people don't realize is that there've actually been just a huge spectrum of radiation released as a result of all of the atomic bomb testing that was done, especially between the 1950s and the late 1980s, all the way up to 1990, and a few more recent ones in North Korea as well. In total, over 2,000 atomic bombs have been exploded, and 520 of them were actually in the atmosphere, leading to the dispersal of all this radiation throughout the world, in fact. So it's a big issue. The other growing source that potentially more likely more important for us as individuals, especially here in the U.S. and other Western or developed countries, is the growing use of medical radiation. The use of medical radiation has increased dramatically over the last few decades. Applications of radiation, including, for instance, like CAT scans and other kinds of X-rays, as well as the use of isotopes for biological imaging. All of these add significant doses to the human population, and we do know that there are risks associated with this additional exposure. Now, that's not to say that the benefits aren't huge, as we all know they are, and it's just we need to realize that there is a sort of a trade-off in terms of the risks and the benefits, and we need to be wary of overexposing ourselves to any kind of source of radiation. So the other sort of source of radiation in the environment, which I'm going to speak about today, concerns the impacts of accidents at nuclear power plants. There have been over 200, at least 200, probably way more than that. Many of that we've just not heard about because they've been top secret at military installations, for instance. But lots and lots of accidents. But the two biggest ones that we know about are the one that occurred in Chernobyl, and as well as in 1986, as well as the more recent triple meltdown and release of radiation in Fukushima, Japan, following the earthquake that occurred there in March of 2011. And actually, recent analyses have suggested that there's very likely to be other large accidents occurring in the future. So yeah, again, we need to be knowledgeable about the potential risks and hazards of this technology, and we can hopefully address the issues that stem. I've been to, of course, I've been to Chernobyl and Fukushima many times, and over the years, and I haven't been to too many of the other accident sites because they're often difficult to access. But Chernobyl and Fukushima have provided lots of information, and I do plan to actually get to a bunch of atomic bomb test sites around the world this coming year, including in the Marshall Islands and southern Algeria and parts of Australia. So Chernobyl, 1986, huge, vast areas of Europe were affected by the radioactivity, equivalent to 400, nuclear bombs like the ones dropped on Hiroshima, just massive releases of radioactivity in the environment. Japan, again, March 11th, 2011, not nearly as big an accident in terms of terrestrial impacts, but of course there was enormous quantities of radioactivity dumped into the Pacific Ocean, and certainly near the power plant where most of the effluent was dumped, there's likely to have been significant consequences for organisms there. We'll get to some of the imagery of what Chernobyl looks like following the accident, and all of the toys and various other things that were left behind. If I have time, I'll show you a little video. Our research started for real started in 2000 with my partner, Anders Moller, from CNRS in France. We also began research in Japan in July of 2011. We're mostly biologists, and we look at birds, insects, microbes, mammals, plants, anything we can catch. And we've been, again, to Chernobyl. We've had at least, I've lost count actually, it's at least 40, personally 40 expeditions to Chernobyl and over 20 to Fukushima in recent years. We've published a whole bunch of scientific papers related to this, and one of the key points I'd like to make for you all is that it's one thing to go and look around and do interesting things, but as a scientist, it's really important that the results be published in scientific journals, and so that we've made quite an effort to make sure that we share our findings with the scientific community and the broader public community through this process of publication in peer-reviewed scientific journals. Let's see, are you worried about the radiation when you visit the sites? Yes, we are, because what we've been studying is, the fact that, whether or not radiation has impacts on mutation rates, and as I'll show you in a second, it does in a big way, especially in Chernobyl where radiation can be quite high. We're also testing for the fact that there's phenotypic consequences as a result of the radiation, birth defects, reproductive rates, survival rates are affected as well. We're also interested in adaptation and how population abundances and biodiversity are affected, as well as ecosystem services, how they might be affected by this. Someone asked here that whether or not radiation in Chernobyl is decreasing. It is and it isn't. It's really kind of interesting. About half of the amount of radionuclides, the isotopes of cesium and strontium, about half of that has disappeared now so far. But because of biological processes, the most contaminated areas in Chernobyl really aren't seeing major drops in radioactivity, and certainly they're not nearly gone down nearly enough to be safe places to be. So although many parts of the Chernobyl zone will eventually be open to the public because of the decay and washing away of the radionuclides, a large part of the most contaminated areas will be off limits for centuries to come. So the first question, the first hypothesis we had was, is there any evidence that the radiation we see in Chernobyl and more recently Fukushima can cause mutations? And so, like good scientists, the first thing we did was to go to the library and see what had already been done. And when we actually go to the library and collect all of the published reports, including our own, put them all together and do what we call a meta-analysis, it was very clear that there's huge amounts of mutation rates and genetic damage is dramatically impacted as a result of the radiation that exists in this place. The evidence is absolutely overwhelming. It's irrefutable, and it's not just our data. So the next step then in this kind of research is to actually go look at the critters, go look at the organisms and see what effects there are. And, and this is really the fun part, being able to go there and get up close and personal with these critters that are living in this environment day in, day out. Most of our work, quite a bit of our work, has been done with birds, and birds are just really cool organisms to be able to do research on. They're relatively easy to catch and see. They're not too afraid of people. And the way we catch them is to stick these giant nets. We would put up basically a quarter-mile of nets every day when we were studying these birds, and place them near the edges of forests and fields. And they look sort of like this. As you can see, that actually one of the cooling towers of Chernobyl in the background here. And the birds, they can't see these mist nets, and so they fly into them and get stuck like a fish in a fishing net. And this allows us to capture hundreds, actually thousands of them over the years. Here's one of my members of my team putting up these nets. A lot of work putting up a quarter-mile of these nets every day. They're all in protective gear, as you can see here, and actually in the background you can see the sort of the venting towers of the Chernobyl background. In the background here, less than a mile away from this particular site in so-called Red Forest. Once we catch the birds, we bring them to our mobile lab, basically picnic tables and tents, and we measure their weight and their size of their body parts, and we also take blood samples and samples of sperm in this case, and some feathers, and so we can actually diagnose whether the birds are being affected in any way. One of the coolest things, it's really cool though, when you go catch these animals, you trap these animals, it's you get to see species that have never been seen anywhere, or you don't get to see very often. And anybody know what this bird is here? It's a very famous bird that's not seen very often, but it's a cuckoo. The cuckoo that makes that sound that cuckoo clocks have. Cuckoo, cuckoo. And we've actually been studying cuckoos quite seriously for the last few years. They're definitely affected by the radiation in the environment as well. Here's an owl, a juvenile owl that just happened to be hanging out in the building. It wasn't afraid of us, allowed us to pick it up and have a good look at it. Again, very, very cool to be able to handle these animals. I don't recommend handling owls with bare hands. They have these really, really sharp claws and a very sharp beak. But this one was so calm, and we really didn't have to worry about that in this case. But our favorite bird is the barn swallow, and the reason for that is that barn swallows, are relatively easy to catch, and they come back to the same nest year after year, so we can follow how long they live, and we can also put special rings on them to identify individuals, and these rings will have TLD dosimeters that measures the radiation that they're exposed to during the previous or the subsequent year. And so this makes these guys a really, really useful tool to do research of this sort. And so we've tracked actually thousands of barn swallows over the years. So anyway, what have we found with birds? And one of the first important result really related to the fact that the germline, the genetic germline of these birds is dramatically impacted by the radiation in the area. Turns out we developed a new method to actually look at the sperm from these birds without hurting them, and to look at their sperm behavior and morphology. And one of the most striking findings was that up to, in some years, up to 40% of the birds in the more radioactive areas were completely sterile. They were incapable of fertilizing eggs. They often had absolutely no sperm or just a few dead sperm. And this was completely surprising and so to us. And so this really was a bellwether warning concerning the impacts of radiation. Fertility effects are well known to, for instance, cancer victims that get radiation therapy, especially if it's prostate cancer. They often become sterile, either temporarily or permanently, and so this isn't unexpected completely. It's just never been seen before. A couple of questions here. Can you explain how radiation decreases? How does it decay? Yeah, so these radioactive isotopes of uranium, plutonium, cesium, strontium, and others, they sort of naturally decay at a set rate and turn into something else. They transmute into other elements which may or may not also be radioactive, depending on which one it is. And so it's that's why they actually use the decay of these isotopes for atomic clocks, because it happens at a very, very predictable rate. Are there physical manifestations of DNA damage due to radiation? That's what we're talking about. One of the characters is this this effect on fertility. Interestingly enough, decreased fertility has been seen in humans as well. Dramatic drops in sperm count, over 50% in Western populations of men since 1973. No one really knows why, but certainly all of this added radiation and other kinds of oxidative stressors in the environment may be in part related to that. And in fact, the BBC, when it read this report, suggested that if this decrease in fertility continues, humans could go extinct. But somehow I doubt that. It's kind of a sensational title, but it is of concern. And the fact that we see it in humans and we see it in birds suggests that this is probably a general phenomenon and certainly could be impacting population growth rates in many species. We've also looked at flowers, plants. Plants have sperm as well. It's in the form of pollen on the male flowers. And when we look at the pollen in Chernobyl, we see again that there's a huge impact of radiation on pollen viability, the ability of pollen to germinate. There's also a few other factors like ploidy that also impact this pollen viability. Again, another manifestation of genetic damage, we think. We published a few studies on this topic recently. And really interestingly, when we compare pollen viability in Chernobyl to that in Fukushima for similar plants, we find that in Fukushima, the year after the disaster, pollen viability was dramatically lower than expected and much lower than in Chernobyl at comparable radiation levels. And what this suggests to us is that in Fukushima, what it suggests is that in Chernobyl, there's been selection that's weeded out, eliminated genotypes for individuals that have susceptibility to radiation effects. And so now, 30 years plus after the accident, we don't see any of the more vulnerable or sensitive individuals or genotypes in these populations. But so in Fukushima, we'd actually expect that this viability to increase over the coming years as the plants adapt to the radiation. And of course, given that the pollen isn't very viable, we also see dramatic decreases in germination rates of the seeds, again likely leading to population declines and reduced biodiversity as a result of these fertility effects. Let's see. So the next category of traits that we think are affected by these mutations include all sorts of developmental abnormalities, as well as tumors. One of the first things most people think of when you say radiation is, cancer. And so we've looked at this in the birds and other animals, and sort of, we see all sorts of gross developmental abnormalities. One of the first things we noticed were that many of the swallows here had patches of white feathers. You can see this on the sort of the chin or the throat of this male barn swallow. He's got all these little white feathers, and this may not seem like a big effect or a big with big consequences, but in fact, for this male here, this is probably a genetic death sentence or a fitness death sentence, in that he probably will not be able to attract a mate, because the females pay very close attention to the intensity of coloration in the throat patterns of these birds, and so females would probably reject this male as a potential mate, and so he would have very, very low fitness. We see also, changes to the feather patterns and symmetry, like these two birds with very asymmetrical tail feathers. Again, the females use symmetry and the length of these tail feathers as an indicator of genetic quality, and prefer to mate with males that have symmetrical long tail feathers. So again, these guys here probably are genetic dead ends, evolutionary dead ends, as a result of the mutational effects on development. We also see just a wide range of other kinds of abnormalities, but the tumors, presumably cancerous tumors, are something that we see at a dramatically elevated rate in the more radioactive areas, and they're usually not seen anywhere else in the world, and at least not at these kinds of frequencies. And so, for instance, here's one of my favorite little birds, this pesky little great tit. It's kind of a sparrow-like bird, but it's yellow and black and white. It's quite colorful. It makes a lot of noise, and they're everywhere, so they're a good study organism. But we've seen many cases of tumors, especially on the heads, as seen in the right photo here on the screen. Again, presumably due to the increased mutation rates. We also see it in other species somewhere. This species right here, again, showed relatively high frequencies in the radioactive areas of tumors on the head and sometimes on the feet. And here's a tumor on another species on the wing that's growing. Again, rarely are these kinds of malformations seen in sort of typical control populations. The next character of interest to us were the eyes of these animals. We know from studies of flight crews and airplanes, commercial airlines, and doctors and workers who handle radiation as part of their jobs, that cataracts in the eyes, opacity in the eyes, occur at an earlier age and at a higher frequency in people who are exposed to radiation. Turns out the lens of the eye is one of the most sensitive tissues to radiation damage because of radiation effects or mutational effects on the stem cells for the lens that is being made every day in most of these animals. And so anyway, so we also looked at the eyes, the lenses of many hundreds of birds, including this one right here. Anyone know what this bird is? No ornithologists out there, I guess. No bird watchers. This is a hoopoe. It's got this big, long beak. It also makes an interesting call, hoopoe, hoopoe. And again, you almost never get a chance to handle or even see these birds. They're quite shy normally. But anyway, after studying all these birds, looking at their eyes, we found that cataracts in their eyes are much more frequent in the more radioactive areas. Took a bunch of pictures, and it's not just cataract in the eyes, but also other kinds of abnormalities in the eye development. Again, the eye tissue seems to be particularly vulnerable to radiation effects. And we've also seen it not just in the birds, but also in mammals, like this mouse from Chernobyl, again at significantly elevated rates. It's also been seen in the humans affected by radiation in Chernobyl, atomic bomb survivors from Japan, and as I said, radiation workers as well. So again, it's a very sensitive tissue that shows the effects of radiation on mutation rates. Another observation from atomic bomb survivors in Japan was smaller brains and high, increased frequencies of mental retardation as a result of radiation exposure. And so we frequencies of mental retardation as a result of radiation exposure. And so we looked at the birds, and sure enough, the birds from the more radioactive areas had relatively smaller brains. Again, completely unexpected. We also found that the birds with smaller brains had a dramatically reduced probability of surviving from one year to the next. So there were likely cognitive consequences of this this radiation effect on neurological development. And so it's also well known that neurological tissue is quite sensitive to the potential effects of radiation exposure. And in Fukushima, Japan, it's also been observed, albeit with less rigor, that head size and likely brain size are reduced in the monkeys living in the radioactive areas of that part of Japan. So again, sort of general results, general findings. You know, I really do a lot of work with insects, and so it's been really fun to study the insects in Chernobyl and Fukushima. This is one of my favorites. This is the firebug. It's called a firebug because it's, you know, kind of bright red in coloration. I call it the face mask bug myself, because when you get rid of the legs around it, you can see it sort of looks like a face mask. You know, it's got two big eyes, a big nose, you know, eyebrows, and a mouth, and so it's really easy to, you know, to visualize this sort of face-looking pattern. It's been suggested that this pattern actually evolved on these insects to warn potential predators like birds that, you know, it doesn't taste good, and we know actually these bugs are certainly distasteful, if not poisonous. And so but anyway, looking at it, you can see you know, that this pattern. What makes this really useful is that it shows dramatic effects of radiation, presumably due to mutations, on the color patterns. And this little graph here shows, you know, 5 bugs collected from around Chernobyl, from clean areas without radioactivity to highly contaminated areas, and you can see the range and level of deformities that are presumably caused by the mutations related to radiation exposure. Actually, a bunch of students in my lab have been raising these bugs, rearing them in the laboratory without radiation, to demonstrate that these deformities are actually genetically based and can be transmitted from one generation to the next through the DNA. So very exciting stuff. There's also been similar kinds of effects demonstrated for butterflies in Japan as well. And you know, again, I'm very interested in invertebrates in general, and another kind of anecdotal observation that we made in Japan, starting in Japan, was that many of the spider webs looked really, really weird, and you know, the hypothesis we had was that this was due to radiation exposure, causing the spiders not to be able to concentrate on building webs. And so we've actually looked at hundreds and hundreds of webs to demonstrate that, yes, in the more radioactive areas, we see stranger webs. Let's see, some new questions. Kenya, what is the status regarding the safety structures of both Chernobyl and Fukushima? Have there been cracks in the sarcophagus at Chernobyl specifically? Yeah, the original sarcophagus in Chernobyl actually was starting to fall apart, and they were really worried that it was going to collapse, particularly after a big snowfall or something. And if it collapsed, there would have been this enormous dust cloud released, particles, nanoparticles of plutonium and uranium would have been released that could have had very significant impacts on the surrounding environment. And, you know, to the extent that when wind was blowing at the time, could have distributed these particles of uranium and plutonium far and wide. And so that's why they built a new containment facility that I'll actually show you some photos of, again, if I have time at the end here. I was going to show you a short video just to give you a feeling for what it looks like in Chernobyl. This is a little video done by the New York Times, and it's pretty cool. It's on YouTube if you want to see it. And,
all right. Well, it looks like
a nice spider web over there. Let's see if we can flip this one.
We missed it up a little bit.
Missed it up a little bit.
You know, what was invisible now becomes visible.
Nice. Yeah, that's perfect.
Invisible?
Yeah, this one's sitting in and being bathed in about 45 microsieverts per hour, plus or minus, which is pretty darn radioactive.
In 1986, an explosion and fire at the nuclear reactor in what was then the Soviet Union in Chernobyl, Ukraine, launched a plume of radioactive fallout that rendered a large swath of the region here uninhabitable. Since then, the creation of a 1,000-square-mile exclusion zone prohibiting human activity has led some to declare the area a restored Eden, brimming with wildlife. But for more than a decade, Timothy Mousseau, an American scientist, has conducted an extensive biological survey here, and his studies have shown that life has been far more slow to recover than previously believed.
It's a perfect area for biological studies because we see a diversity of plants and animals. It's one of the hotter areas in the Chernobyl zone, and so from our previous work we know that this level of chronic exposure is above that most species will tolerate.
Over here.
This year we've been looking at the small rodents, we've been looking at spiders. Earlier this year we were here working with the birds. We found that the abundance of many species of birds are depressed in these areas of high contamination, leading to an overall decrease in the biodiversity on the order of 50% fewer species in hot areas than there should be if there wasn't radioactivity in the area.
Mousseau says he has seen much higher frequencies of tumors and physical abnormalities, like deformed beaks among birds, compared with those from uncontaminated areas. He has measured declines in populations of insects and spiders, and yet in a recent paper released last month, Mousseau has also shown that some birds here may actually be adapting to high radiation levels.
To pick up the... Let's see if it goes up. Well, look at that, eh? 43. After visiting Fukushima last year, that some of the spider webs looked a little strange. And so we thought we would test that hypothesis in a very scientific way by capturing images of as many spider webs as we can find in hot and cold areas of the same kinds of species, to see if there's more variability or less structure to the webs in these radioactive areas. It could serve as a biomarker of the background radiation. We're in the town of Chernobyl.
Okay, let's get back to the slides. Yeah, so that's what it looks like. It looks sort of normal, but radiation is definitely working in the background. Okay, well, the main topic, of course, for today is what effects do all these sort of genetic and physiological and developmental consequences have in terms of abundance and diversity. We've spent a lot of time and effort looking at this, especially since there seems to be a number of reports. Oh, let's see, is it too loud or what's wrong with the microphone? How's that? Okay, I'll try to keep it steady here for you. Sorry about that. Anyway, since there's been this suggestion in a lot of TV shows that the wildlife was thriving in the area, and to some extent that's true because Chernobyl isn't just all radioactivity. A lot of the Chernobyl zone is actually fairly cutting in and out. Sorry about that. I'll try doing that. Just let me know if I'm still cutting in and out, and I'll just unplug the microphone, I suppose, and use the microphone in the computer. But anyway, it's been suggested that it's thriving, but it's really not in the radioactive areas. But again, at this, we visited both Chernobyl and Fukushima and counted organisms at hundreds of locations over multiple years. In Fukushima, 400 locations, and taking these biotic inventories in many different places. And so the bottom line is, for birds, the numbers are dramatically reduced in the areas of high contamination, and the biodiversity is also reduced by about 50% in the more contaminated areas. So it's clear that this radiation effect is general across all birds. We've also surveyed mammals, insects, spiders, amphibians, snakes, and all of them showed significant declines in the more radioactive areas. So this is a general phenomenon in Chernobyl. Not every species is affected, but these groups as a whole show declines. When we go to Fukushima, we've actually been monitoring Fukushima since the time of the disaster, and when we look at the birds, for instance, we see that again, dramatic reductions in the areas of higher contamination. You just can't. It's just overwhelming. In areas of significant contamination, you're likely to see very many fewer birds, and the effects on biodiversity are even more dramatic, as you can see at sort of the right-hand side of this graph. In Fukushima, in the hot areas, you're only likely to see 2 or 3 species, whereas in the cool areas and the uncontaminated areas, you might see as many as 10 species in a given spot. So highly significant dramatic effects. I was going to show a little video of what it sounded like, but in hot and cold areas, but the videos aren't working. So we'll just skip ahead, and again, it's not going. Let's try moving here. The last thing I wanted to talk about was our surveys of mammals. We've actually been using hundreds and hundreds of these motion-activated cameras in both Chernobyl, Fukushima, and in the U.S. to look at mammal diversity and abundance. And it's really, really cool. These cameras, because they're hidden and they're motion-activated, the animals don't mind them, and so we get all sorts of interesting critters walking by. Lots and lots of wild pigs and foxes. Even in Chernobyl, we actually see lynx coming in now that weren't there before. Again, mostly in the clean areas. In Japan, here's the first bear to be observed in Fukushima, this part of Fukushima in Japan, for well over 100 years, and so these animals are finding their way to these empty spots, but they're not necessarily doing well once they get there. This was another video of monkeys, but it's not working. Lots and lots of deer, especially in Chernobyl, and even these wild horses, these Chernobyl horses that were introduced to Chernobyl are doing okay. And this is the wild progenitor to the modern domestic horse. You can see they actually have zebra stripes on the bottom of their legs, which is kind of cool. Moose, and of course, lots and lots of deer. And so, very cool. I think I'll skip the short videos and just mention that when we do the analysis in Fukushima, we see that over in the right panel here, that radiation has a fairly dramatic effect on the diversity and abundance of the mammals, at least at this stage. We've been monitoring for several years now, and we'll definitely get to this thing. So sort of final, not quite final slide, but conclusion. It's very clear that even though in some areas of Chernobyl, numbers of animals definitely are increasing as a result of there being no hunting for many years, and the fact that many parts of Chernobyl actually are not radioactive. But in the areas of high radioactivity, lots and lots of data now showing increased rates of mutations and other phenotypic effects that are having impacts on population sizes and biodiversity, and likely effects on the ecosystem functioning. So one other reason for studying radiation is that people are very interested in right now is that the Earth's atmosphere and electromagnetic field protects us from radiation. from the sun in particular. But when we travel, when there's human travel to say Mars, these astronauts are going to get humongous doses of radiation, and so this is another reason for wanting to know more about the effects of radiation. For those of you who are interested in things like travel to Mars, I certainly encourage you to watch a new series, a National Geographic series called One Strange Rock. It's a very cool series of TV shows. It's on Netflix now, I hear, and certainly if you have cable, you'll be able to download them. But there's a segment of our research in Chernobyl there as well. I'm not sure if I have time to show it. Maybe I'll show a couple minutes of it just to give you a different view of Chernobyl as seen by this Nat Geo video. And this is, I'm not sure if the volume is going to be high enough to really hear it, but some of the video is great. The audio is not too terrific, but
you need to prepare for that. You can start in a place where the deep space mission.
Two drone clickers and two regular camera guys, and lighting and
Despite the fact that this is a
dangerous
Chernobyl provides us unique opportunity.
Chernobyl provides us unique opportunity to examine
evolutionary
what happens to the evolutionary process when you kick it with a little extra mutation.
Back in '86, there are these hot spots. Landscape that was once
this landscape that was once breaks alongside some of the houses
or
and
spiders.
villages.
African face mask.
Big eyes, nose, and
Firebug.
And because of this symmetry,
it
makes it very easy
to detect deviations.
One of my colleagues picked one up.
And said,
it's a mutant.
"Look, Tim, it's a mutant."
Just one bug
This
was
one bug was missing one of the eye spots.
So we started collecting.
As many bugs as we could find.
Bugs with really unusual
color patterns were only found in these areas of high radiation.
This is more serious
seriously changing your spots.
Mutations
can kill you.
Humans in space
have a big problem.
So mission canceled?
Not so fast.
Be a fix.
There might be a fix.
And I think that's all I'll say for now on that. Let's see. I don't have time to talk about dogs, but so let me get back to the questions then. We have 12 minutes here. So how much radiation? Let's see. Knowing what you know now, what are your concerns regarding the safety of nuclear energy? So the nuclear energy is a wonderful thing. Nuclear energy provides enormous quantities of electricity, relatively, and the main benefit of it is, of course, is that it's relatively carbon-free. It doesn't emit a lot of CO2 during this process. The problem with nuclear energy is that it is unbelievably expensive to implement, given all of the safety issues that have to be addressed in order to reduce the emissions of radioactivity, as well as the potential for accidents like we've seen in Chernobyl and Fukushima and elsewhere. And so at this point in time, at this juncture in our history, it actually makes a lot more sense to invest in renewable energy sources like wind and solar, simply because we now have the technology to implement wind and solar at an industrial scale and actually to provide much of what we need from energy without the potential costs and dangers of accidents at nuclear power plants. How much radiation can a human take? Well, and this really kind of ties into the next question here, which is, does radiation have the same effect on one animal versus another? And what we excuse me, what we have discovered from our studies is that there's tremendous variability in the sensitivity of both individuals of the same species, sexes of the same species. In some ways, females tend to be much more sensitive to the effects of radiation, although in other ways, males are as well, but it sort of all depends on where in the life cycle you're looking. And as you know, males are not as necessary in most populations. It's really the females that are important in terms of determining population growth rates. And so there's also tremendous variation among species in their sensitivity. Some species we've found are incredibly sensitive, dramatically impacted, like the barn swallows, which have essentially gone extinct in the more radioactive areas of Chernobyl and Fukushima. But other species, for instance, that great tit I was showing you, actually, even though it shows elevated rates of tumors and cataract, it seems to be quite happy to, it doesn't seem to have a long-term population level effects on that species. And we think it has something to do with both its ability to repair DNA damage, as well as its ability to allocate antioxidants that it acquires from dietary sources to the prevention of damage from the oxidative stress induced by radiation. And so tons of variation. And actually, one of the things we'd like to be able to address is why there's this variation and whether we can actually make use of that knowledge to design ways to prevent genetic damage and other kinds of effects of radiation for things like space travel, as well as reducing the potential consequences of radiation therapy and medical uses. So there's a lot of reasons for wanting to know more about the effects of radiation, and particularly why it varies from individual to individual and species to species. Let's see. Any other questions out there? That's really it for my formal presentation. I can certainly go on and on about most of these topics. I can't hear anybody, but you can hear me, right? So, okay. Oh, no other questions from out there? Oh, somebody's typing. Okay, well, there are no further questions. I guess I'll let you all get back to your daily classroom activities. Let's see. Are you ever afraid that radiation will affect you? Good question. And yes, very afraid. And in fact, I'm not going to give you any of the details, but I have actually had some medical consequences of the exposure that I've received over the years. I've been going there for, like I said, 20 years. Initially, I wasn't worried because the conventional wisdom back when we started researching this topic was that the levels of radiation seen in Chernobyl were really not that high, or at least not that damaging. And so we weren't that worried about it. And then when we realized that that wasn't true, that in fact most organisms that we looked at in Chernobyl are on the order of 8 times more sensitive to radiation than the experiments that have been done in the laboratory have shown. What this means to us is that it's really difficult to extrapolate from laboratory experiments to natural conditions. And one of the reasons being that organisms living in the wild experience a wide range of different environmental stressors, including predators and parasites and diseases, and so it's very clear that when you're actually out in the wild, you're getting a more biologically stronger effect as a result of this exposure, and this probably applies to the people as well. And the other key issue is that in the wild, we're looking at populations that have actually been exposed to radiation for many generations since the time of the accident, and so what we're actually finding now is that it's this cumulative exposure over multiple generations that is perhaps most important. We think it's more important than the actual ambient dose that the individual is getting during its own lifetime. But this individual inherits multiple past generations worth of exposure to the radiation. And so more technically speaking, we're finding that the historical dose received by a lineage, a population, has a significant is a significant predictor of genetic and population consequences that we observe now. And so, yeah, no, this is a really important question. How much of the genetic damage, how much of the damage is transmitted from one generation to the next, and can it accumulate onto the next generation? Okay, looks like we're done. Thank you so much, everybody. Been nice talking to you. Have a good day. Oh, one last question, I guess. We got 2 minutes. The new books, there's actually 3 or 4 new books. The one you're probably talking about is the one by Adam Higginbottom, and it's a very good read. Highly recommend it. Very entertaining. But there's another book coming out by Kate Brown, a historian at MIT. It'll be out next month. Definitely worth reading. And there's a couple of other recent books as well. Okay, well, I'm going to sign off now. Thank you very much, everyone. Nice to meet you.